Long before the chronicles were written, before the ink of monks hardened into official memory, there was a whisper, not a declaration, not a battle cry, not even a prophecy spoken aloud, but something quieter, more dangerous. A knowing, a sense that a royal bloodline, one unlike any other, was never meant to end in fire or spectacle. Its fate was something far more unsettling. It was meant to fade. In the early dawn of medieval Europe, when forests still swallowed roads and the night carried meanings the modern world has forgotten, kings were not merely rulers. They were symbols, vessels, living bridges between the earthly and the divine. And among them rose a dynasty that later historians would reduce to footnotes and insults, the Merovingians. The do-nothing kings, they would be called. Weak, ineffective, relics of a primitive age. But history is rarely so simple, and almost never so honest. What if this dismissal was not an accident? What if the Merovingians were not forgotten because they were insignificant, but because remembering them was dangerous? This story does not begin with a crown falling or an army marching. It begins with silence, with omission, with gaps in the record so wide that entire lifetimes disappear between lines of text. It begins with the unsettling realization that some dynasties do not fall. They are erased. The Merovingians ruled the Frankish kingdoms for nearly 3 centuries. That alone should demand attention. Dynasties that weak do not survive that long. Yet when modern history tells their story, it rushes. It skips. It simplifies. Their reign becomes a slow decline, a prelude to something greater, something more orderly, more acceptable. The rise of the Carolingians, the blessing of the church, the dawn of a new Europe. But this narrative depends on one assumption, that the Merovingians were already fading, already irrelevant. And yet, beneath that polished storyline, older sources speak differently. They speak in riddles and metaphors, in religious symbolism and half-suppressed legends. They describe kings whose power was not exercised through law or sword, but through presence. Kings whose authority was believed to reside in their blood, their bodies, even their hair. Kings who were not meant to rule actively, but to exist, guardians rather than governors. This is where the whisper begins. In some traditions, twilight is not an ending. It is a threshold, a moment between visibility and darkness, where forms still exist but cannot be clearly seen. The Merovingian fall, according to these traditions, was not a collapse into ruin, but an entry into twilight, a state of dormancy, of concealment, of survival through disappearance. Official history does not like such ideas. It prefers clean transitions, decisive victories, rightful successions. But the Merovingian story resists this structure. There is no single overthrow, no dramatic execution of the line. Instead, power drains away slowly, like light at sunset. Kings remain crowned but powerless. Their names recorded, but their actions ignored. Their presence tolerated, until even that becomes unnecessary. And this is where suspicion grows. Because silence is not neutrality. Silence is often intentional. Why do some Merovingian kings vanish from records entirely? Why are others described only as shadows, their reigns summarized in a sentence or two? Why does ridicule replace analysis, as if mockery itself were a tool of historical closure? These are not the patterns of simple decline. They're the fingerprints of something else, containment. Early medieval Europe was obsessed with legitimacy. Who had the right to rule? From where did authority come? From conquest? From God? From blood? The Merovingians represented an older answer to that question, one that predated papal coronations and theological contracts between throne and altar. Their authority did not require constant demonstration. It was assumed, inherited, almost feared. To later powers, especially a rising church that sought spiritual monopoly, such a concept was intolerable. And so the whisper became a strategy. Rather than destroy the bloodline openly, it was neutralized symbolically. Rather than martyr kings, they were turned into fools. Rather than erase them violently, they were buried beneath narrative. Their sacred qualities were redefined as superstition, their mythic origins reframed as embarrassment, their memory dulled until no one would think to ask what had truly been lost. But traces remain. They always do. In monastery margins, in half-legible genealogies, in local legends that refuse to align with official timelines, in the strange reverence shown to Merovingian burial sites long after their supposed irrelevance, in the discomfort of later chroniclers who explain too much too defensively, as if arguing against an accusation no one has yet spoken aloud. This section is not about proving a conspiracy. It is about recognizing a pattern. When history grows quiet around a subject that should be loud, that quiet itself becomes evidence. The Merovingian Prophecy of Twilight, whatever its original form, was never a single text. It was a way of understanding time and power, a belief that certain bloodlines do not die, they withdraw. That visibility is vulnerability. That survival sometimes requires absence. If this sounds implausible, consider how often history repeats this lesson. How many movements, traditions, or families survive precisely because they stepped out of sight? How often has disappearance been mistaken for defeat? The whisper before the fall is not a warning shouted from a tower. It is the sound of doors closing softly, of names no longer spoken, of kings still alive but already treated as ghosts. As this story unfolds, we will move deeper into the space between what is recorded and what is remembered. We will examine myths that historians dismiss too quickly, symbols that appear too consistently to be coincidence, and silences that grow louder the longer we listen to them. Because the Merovingians did not vanish in a moment. They faded by design or by prophecy. And twilight, once entered, does not mean the sun is gone forever. It only means it can no longer be seen. Every civilization tells stories about its beginnings, its heroes, and its rightful rulers. These stories are repeated so often that they harden into truth, not because they are unquestionable, but because questioning them becomes inconvenient. The Merovingians suffer precisely this fate. Their story, as it survives in textbooks and simplified documentaries, appears settled, clear, finished. And yet, the more closely one examines this official version, the more it begins to feel like a carefully sealed room, tidy on the surface, but hiding something uncomfortable beneath the floorboards. According to mainstream history, the Merovingians were a transitional dynasty. They rose in the chaotic aftermath of Roman collapse, ruled clumsily, and gradually gave way to more competent leadership. Their later kings are described as lazy, ineffective, even childlike, mere figureheads while real power passed into the hands of advisors and administrators. The narrative is neat, a necessary but flawed chapter before the emergence of stronger governance under the Carolingians and the guiding hand of the Church. This explanation is reassuring. It suggests progress, evolution, the idea that history moves forward by replacing the weak with the strong. But this version of events depends on one assumption above all others, that the Merovingians were never meant to last, and certainly never meant to be remembered with reverence. Yet history rarely erases what is truly insignificant. If the Merovingians were simply poor rulers, why did later chroniclers invest so much effort in diminishing them? Why mock them rather than ignore them? Why portray them as grotesque caricatures? Long-haired, idle, half-mythical kings lounging while others governed. Ridicule is a powerful weapon, and it is seldom used without purpose. The do-nothing kings label appears centuries after many of the events it claims to describe. It emerges from sources written under regimes that benefited directly from Merovingian delegitimization. These accounts were not neutral observations. They were political literature. And political literature has one primary function: to justify the present by reshaping the past. The forbidden story begins here, not as an alternative fantasy, but as a question of motive. Early Frankish society did not operate on modern notions of leadership. Kingship was not merely administrative. It was sacred. A king was believed to embody the health of the land, the favor of the divine, the continuity of the people. The Merovingians, more than any dynasty that followed, were bound to this older conception. Their legitimacy was not granted by councils or coronations, but assumed by lineage. They did not need to prove authority. They inherited it. To a rising bureaucratic and ecclesiastical order, this posed a problem. The Church, in particular, sought a world in which authority flowed downward from God through sanctioned institutions. Divine kingship based on blood alone disrupted that structure. It created a competing source of sacred legitimacy, one that could not be easily controlled, negotiated, or revoked. As long as the Merovingians existed as a recognized bloodline, the idea of authority independent of the Church remained alive. And so the narrative shifted. In the official story, Merovingian decline is portrayed as natural and inevitable. In the Forbidden One, it is intentional and managed. Power was not seized in a single stroke, it was drained slowly. The kings remained, but their function was hollowed out. Over time, the public grew accustomed to seeing them as ceremonial, irrelevant, almost embarrassing. When they were finally removed, few objected because few remembered why they had mattered in the first place. This is not how accidental decline works. This is how memory is engineered. Consider how often official histories emphasize administrative inefficiency while ignoring symbolic authority. The Merovingians may not have governed actively in their later years, but that does not mean they were powerless. In societies where symbols shape reality, presence itself can be power. A crowned king who does nothing can still embody legitimacy that others rely upon. Remove that symbol, and the entire structure must be rebuilt. The forbidden narrative suggests that this was precisely the point. The Merovingians were tolerated only as long as their presence served others. Once alternative structures of legitimacy were in place, papal blessing, military dominance, bureaucratic control, the kings became expendable. And yet, even then, they were not simply eliminated. Instead, they were reframed. The official story insists that there is nothing mysterious here. No secrets, no suppression, just the slow march of history. But history does not usually go to such lengths to explain why something is unimportant. It does not repeatedly reassure us that there is nothing to see unless there once was something worth seeing. The forbidden story lives in contradictions. In the fact that Merovingian ancestry was still quietly respected generations after their fall. In the unusual care taken with their burials. In the persistence of legends linking them to divine or semi-divine origins. Legends that were never fully erased, only discouraged. It lives in the discomfort of later writers who describe Merovingian kings with a mixture of contempt and fascination, as if unsure whether they are dismissing relics or dangerous reminders. And most of all, it lives in what is missing. There are reigns with no records, decisions never explained, transitions glossed over, silence where one would expect debate, conflict, or outrage. These gaps are not neutral. They are spaces where alternative memories once existed, memories that did not align with the version of history that eventually won. The contrast between the official and forbidden stories is not a battle between truth and fiction. It is a battle between convenience and complexity. The official story simplifies. The forbidden one complicates. It asks why certain narratives were chosen and others quietly abandoned. To listen to the forbidden story is not to reject history, but to read it more carefully. To notice who is speaking and who benefits from their words. To understand that the past we inherit is not the past as it was, but the past as it was allowed to be remembered. As we move forward, this tension will only deepen. The Merovingians will appear again and again as contradictions, mocked yet feared, forgotten yet persistent, dismissed yet strangely central to later myths and obsessions. The official story wants closure. The forbidden one refuses it. And somewhere between the two lies the truth, not loudly proclaimed, but waiting like a voice just beneath the surface of the text, asking to be heard. Every royal dynasty begins with a story, but not every dynasty begins with a myth that refuses to stay buried. The origins of the Merovingians are not simply obscure. They are deliberately strange. So strange, in fact, that later historians often dismiss them outright, treating their founding legend as an embarrassment best ignored. Yet myths do not emerge randomly, and they do not survive for centuries without reason, especially when those myths are quietly preserved even as the dynasty they describe is slowly erased. According to early Frankish tradition, the Merovingian line does not begin with a man alone, but with an encounter. Merovech, the semi-legendary ancestor from whom the dynasty takes its name, is said to have been conceived through a mysterious union involving the sea. One account speaks of his mother encountering a creature known as the Quinator, a being described neither fully human nor fully beast, associated with the waters, fertility, and the unknown. From this union, Merovech is born, carrying within him a dual nature. Modern readers often recoil at this story. It sounds pagan, uncomfortable, irrational. And that reaction is precisely why it matters. In the ancient world, especially in societies emerging from Roman collapse, myth was not separate from legitimacy. Myth was legitimacy. To claim descent from a divine or semi-divine source was not metaphorical. It was political theology. Such stories explained why a family ruled, not merely how. They placed kingship outside ordinary human competition and into the realm of destiny. The sea itself is significant. Across Indo-European and Mediterranean traditions, the sea represents chaos, origin, and hidden depth. It is the boundary between worlds. To be born of the sea is to come from the unknown, carrying authority that cannot be traced to land, tribe, or conquest alone. It is power without a visible source. This made the Merovingians different. Unlike later dynasties that carefully documented their lineage through legal inheritance or papal approval, the Merovingians were rooted in something older and less controllable. Their mythic origins suggested that their authority did not depend on recognition. It simply existed, and this frightened those who came later. The Quinator itself has been widely misunderstood, often ridiculed as a crude monster. Its symbolism is more subtle. The name suggests a fusion, five-horned, multiple, layered. Scholars have long debated whether it represents a deity, a totem, or a symbolic merging of tribal and divine bloodlines. What matters is not the literal creature, but the idea it conveys. The Merovingians were not entirely of this world. Early medieval chroniclers recorded this myth with hesitation, sometimes offering multiple versions, sometimes distancing themselves from it entirely. Yet they still wrote it down. They cannot bring themselves to erase it completely. That alone is telling. If the story were meaningless, it would not survive. If it were harmless, it would not need to be softened. As Christianity spread and consolidated power, such origin myths became problematic. Divine bloodlines outside the biblical framework challenged the Church's monopoly on sacred authority. Kings could be anointed, but they could not be born divine unless that divinity flowed through church-sanctioned channels. The Merovingian myth did not, and so was reframed. What was once sacred became primitive. What was once symbolic became shameful. The sea-born origin was reduced to folklore, then to superstition, then to an awkward footnote. But it was never fully denied. Instead, it was quietly pushed aside, as if acknowledging it too strongly might awaken something better left dormant. Yet beneath this dismissal, the myth continued to shape how the Merovingians were perceived. They were believed to possess healing powers. Their presence was thought to bless the land. Their long hair was treated not as fashion, but as a conduit of power, an outward sign of their otherworldly origin. To cut a Merovingian king's hair was not merely humiliation. It was symbolic castration, a severing of sacred connection. These beliefs did not arise in a vacuum. They were the cultural echoes of the dynasty's mythic beginning. A bloodline born from the sea could not be reduced to ordinary humanity. It carried an aura that neither sword nor crown alone could produce. This is why later regimes were so eager to mock the myth rather than confront it. Ridicule is safer than refutation. To argue seriously against a sacred origin is to acknowledge its power. To laugh at it is to drain it quietly. But myths have a way of outlasting laughter. Even as official histories moved away from the Quinator legend, its themes resurfaced elsewhere. In medieval romances, in Grail stories, in strange genealogies that link Merovingians to sacred guardianship rather than political rule. The sea becomes the Grail. The unknown becomes divine mystery. The bloodline becomes symbolic rather than literal, but the structure remains. The forbidden question is this: what if the myth was never meant to be understood literally? What if it was encoded language for something else? An ancient alliance, a sacred role, a lineage marked not by biology alone, but by function. To ancient minds, myth was a way of preserving truth across time without exposing it directly. A story could survive where a document might be destroyed. A legend could pass orally where a record might be censored. The Merovingian origin myth may have been precisely this, a container for meaning too dangerous to state plainly. This would explain why it survived at all. As the dynasty moved closer to its twilight, these myths became liabilities. A bloodline that claimed sacred origin could not be easily replaced by one that relied on papal endorsement and military efficiency. The old story had to be neutralized, not disproven, but emptied of authority. And yet, the sea does not forget. The idea that the Merovingians came from somewhere beyond ordinary history continues to haunt the margins of scholarship. It surfaces in uncomfortable questions, in speculative footnotes, in theories dismissed too quickly to be properly examined. Why did this dynasty inspire such unusual reverence? Why were their symbols treated with ritual seriousness? Why does their origin story feel less like fiction and more like coded memory? As we move deeper into their history, this myth will begin to feel less like a curiosity and more like a foundation. Everything that follows, their strange form of kingship, their passive authority, their symbolic power, and ultimately their silent disappearance, makes more sense when viewed through the lens of an origin that was never meant to be ordinary. The Merovingians did not begin as conquerors. They began as something older, stranger, and harder to control. They began, according to memory and myth alike, not on land, but in the depths where history blurs into something else and power emerges without asking permission to exist. To understand why the Merovingians were treated differently from every dynasty that followed, one must let go of the modern idea that power comes only from governance. In the early medieval world, authority was not measured by laws passed or battles won. It was measured by essence, by lineage, by blood. And in this realm, the Merovingians were not merely royal, they were sacred. This distinction is subtle but crucial. Many kings ruled because they conquered or negotiated. The Merovingians ruled because they were believed to be something. Their blood was thought to carry legitimacy in a way that no coronation could create and no decree could undo. It was not symbolic in the modern sense. It was biological, spiritual, and inherited. You were not chosen to be a Merovingian king. You were born one. This belief permeated early Frankish society. Chroniclers describe the Merovingian kings not as lawmakers or commanders, but as living vessels of authority. They sat on the throne not to act, but to be seen. Their mere presence sanctified decisions made by others. Their approval, even if passive, transformed administrative action into legitimate rule. To modern historians, this appears inefficient, even absurd. But to a society steeped in sacred kingship traditions, it was logical. Power did not flow upward from the people. It flowed outward from the king's body. His bloodline connected past, present, and future in an unbroken chain. Break that chain, and the world itself risked disorder. This is why the Merovingians inspired such deep reverence and such deep anxiety. Their long hair, for example, was not a cosmetic choice. It was a sacred marker. Across multiple ancient cultures, hair symbolized vitality, strength, and divine favor. In Merovingian case, it was believed to hold their power. To cut a king's hair was to strip him of legitimacy, rendering him unfit to rule. This was not metaphorical. It was ritual. When defeated Merovingian princes were tonsured and sent to monasteries, it was not mercy. It was annihilation without bloodshed. This practice alone reveals how seriously their sacred status was taken. No later dynasty required such symbolic disarmament. No Carolingian king lost authority because his hair was cut. Only the Merovingians carried a belief system so old, so deeply embedded, that physical markers of their bodies were treated as conduits of power. The church recognized this and feared it. Christian theology allowed for divine authority, but only when mediated through the church itself. Kings could be anointed by bishops, crowned in sacred rituals, and blessed as God's representatives. But they could not possess innate divinity. Not independently. Not biologically. The Merovingian belief system violated this rule. It suggested that sacred authority could exist outside ecclesiastical control, inherited without permission. As Christianity spread and institutionalized, this became an unacceptable anomaly. The response was gradual and calculated. Rather than directly confronting the belief in sacred blood, it was reinterpreted. Slowly, the Merovingians were reframed as primitive kings clinging to outdated customs. Their rituals became superstition. Their sacred status became legend. Their passivity was no longer a sign of symbolic authority, but of incompetence. But beliefs like these do not vanish overnight. They linger in practice long after they are rejected in theory. Even as Merovingian political power declined, their bloodline remained dangerous. Rivals did not simply replace them. They married into their lineage. Administrators ruled in their name. New elites required their symbolic endorsement, even as they mocked them behind closed doors. This contradiction is telling. If the Merovingians were truly irrelevant, they could have been discarded openly. Instead, they were kept, contained, diminished, but still present. This is the paradox of sacred blood. It cannot be destroyed without consequences. It must be neutralized carefully. The forbidden narrative suggests that the Merovingians were not overthrown because overthrow would have validated their power. Killing a sacred king risks turning him into a martyr, or worse, confirming his divinity. Instead, they were allowed to live without agency, to exist without authority, to become ghosts on their own thrones. And yet, even in this weakened state, their blood continued to matter. Genealogies from the early medieval period show unusual attention paid to Merovingian descent. Marriages were arranged not for territory, but for lineage. Noble families trace their origins back to Merovingian ancestors long after the dynasty's fall. These claims were not always publicized, but they were preserved, sometimes obsessively. Why? Because blood remembers what history tries to forget. The idea that the Merovingians carried something sacred also explains the peculiar restraint shown toward them by later rulers. When the Carolingians finally removed the last Merovingian king, he was not executed. He was tonsured and sent into monastic confinement. His blood was spared. His body lived on, stripped of visibility but not destroyed. This was not kindness. It was caution. To spill Merovingian blood may have been seen as a violation of cosmic order. Better to silence it, isolate it, and allow its significance to fade quietly. Better to let time do what violence could not. Yet sacred blood does not disappear simply because it is hidden. Legends persist of Merovingian healing powers, of royal touch, of blessings associated with their presence. These stories are often dismissed as medieval superstition, but they reveal something deeper, a collective memory of a bloodline believed to bridge worlds, to connect the human and the divine without institutional mediation. This memory becomes especially dangerous in times of crisis. When authority fractures, people look backward, to origins, to blood, to legitimacy that feels older than law. It is no coincidence that Merovingian myths resurface in later centuries, during periods of religious conflict, political instability, and identity crisis. The church and emerging monarchies understood this risk. A bloodline with sacred status could not be allowed to re-emerge as a focal point for dissent or alternative authority. And so the narrative of sacred blood was buried beneath ridicule, silence, and selective memory. But buried things shaped the ground above them. As we move deeper into the Merovingian story, this concept of sacred blood will echo again and again. It will explain why their fall was so careful, why their disappearance was so quiet, why later generations became obsessed with tracing, preserving, or rediscovering their lineage. Because if the Merovingians were merely kings, their end would have been unremarkable. But if they were something more, something believed to be chosen, marked, and set apart, then their twilight was not an accident. It was a necessity. And necessity, when driven by fear, rarely leaves history untouched. By the time the Merovingian dynasty reached its height, something about their rule already felt paradoxical. They were kings who rarely governed, sovereigns who commanded reverence without issuing commands, rulers whose authority was unquestioned even as their involvement in daily affairs diminished. To later historians, this appeared as weakness. To the world in which they lived, it was something else entirely. The Merovingians were not meant to rule in the modern sense of the word. Their long hair, so often mocked by chroniclers writing centuries later, was not an aesthetic curiosity. It was a declaration of identity. In early Frankish culture, hair was a visible marker of sacred status, vitality, and continuity. Warriors cut their hair in mourning. Slaves were shorn as a sign of submission. Kings, especially Merovingian kings, let their hair grow long as proof that they were set apart from ordinary men. This physical distinction reinforced a deeper truth about their role. The Merovingians embodied kingship rather than exercising it. Their authority was passive but absolute, symbolic rather than administrative. They were living anchors of legitimacy, around whom power could organize itself without ever truly belonging to them. This explains a mystery that has long puzzled historians. Why did the Merovingians allow others to rule in their name? The answer lies in the nature of sacred authority. In societies where kingship is believed to be divinely inherited, action is secondary to presence. The king does not need to issue orders because his existence alone validates the social order. Others act on his behalf, drawing legitimacy from proximity to his blood and body. The king remains untouched by the corruption of administration, preserved as a symbol rather than consumed by governance. In this system, the Merovingians functioned almost like relics, alive, revered, but carefully insulated. They were not expected to command armies or manage territories. They were expected to endure, to exist unbroken through generations, ensuring continuity in a world that was anything but stable. This arrangement worked until it didn't. As the Frankish realms expanded and governance grew more complex, those who acted in the king's name accumulated real power. Mayors of the palace, administrators, military leaders, these figures became indispensable. They managed resources, commanded troops, negotiated alliances. Over time, their practical authority eclipsed the symbolic authority of the king. But here is the crucial point. This was not initially a usurpation. It was a partnership. The Merovingians allowed this structure because it preserved what mattered most, the sanctity of their bloodline. They remained above politics, untouched by its compromises. Others governed, but always under the shadow of royal legitimacy. As long as the king existed, the system held. Later historians would misinterpret this as incompetence. They would see kings who did nothing and assume failure. What they failed to understand is that the Merovingians were doing exactly what their role required. They were not meant to rule. This realization transforms how we interpret their decline. What appears as passivity becomes restraint. What looks like irrelevance becomes intentional distance. The Merovingians were not losing power accidentally. They were maintaining a form of power that was increasingly out of place in a changing world. The problem was that symbolic authority without control is vulnerable. As generations passed, those who wielded real power grew less dependent on the symbol that legitimized them. The presence of a sacred king became a formality rather than a necessity. And once legitimacy could be manufactured elsewhere, through military success, papal blessing, or administrative efficiency, the Merovingians' unique role became a liability. Yet even then, they were not discarded immediately. Their long hair continued to inspire awe. Their bodies continued to command respect. Even powerless Merovingian kings were treated with ritual care. When they traveled, people gathered to see them. When they died, they were buried with reverence. These were not the customs afforded to irrelevant figures. This tension between symbolic authority and practical power created a slow, almost invisible crisis. The kings remained sacred, but increasingly unnecessary. And in systems of power, unnecessary sanctity is dangerous. It reminds people of older truths. It challenges new hierarchies. So the narrative began to change. Chroniclers started describing the kings as childish, gluttonous, idle. Their long hair, once a sacred emblem, became a punchline. Their symbolic distance from governance was reinterpreted as laziness. Their restraint became weakness. Language did the work that violence had not yet done. This reframing was not accidental. It prepared the cultural ground for their removal. Once people believed the kings were useless, few would question why they were replaced. Once sacred authority was ridiculed, it could be safely dismantled. But dismantling it required care. To strip a Merovingian king of his hair was to strip him of his identity. This act appears repeatedly in the historical record, always at moments of transition. The cutting of hair transformed a sacred body into an ordinary one. It did what no army could do. It ended legitimacy without bloodshed. The kings who were shorn and sent to monasteries were not defeated. They were neutralized. This practice reveals something profound about the fear the Merovingians inspired. If they truly had no power, there would be no need for such elaborate symbolic destruction. If they were simply obsolete, they could have been ignored. Instead, every effort was made to ensure that their presence could no longer function as a focal point for authority. And yet, the memory of what they represented could not be so easily erased. The image of the long-haired king lingered. It surfaced in later legends, in romanticized accounts of ancient rule, in myths of lost golden ages. It became a symbol of a different kind of kingship, one not based on domination, but on being. As we move deeper into the Merovingian twilight, this distinction will become increasingly important. Their fall was not the failure of rulers who could not adapt. It was the deliberate sidelining of a form of authority that no longer fit the emerging world order. They were not defeated because they ruled poorly. They were removed because they represented something that could not be controlled. And in a world moving toward centralized power, sacred blood without obedience was the most dangerous thing of all. While the Merovingian kings sat on their thrones as symbols of continuity and sacred legitimacy, another form of power was quietly learning how to move. It did not announce itself with crowns or myths. It did not claim divine blood or ancient destiny. Instead, it worked in shadows, in routines, in administration. It learned how to function while others merely represented. And over time, it learned something more dangerous: how to rule without being seen. The mayors of the palace began as servants. Originally, their role was practical and unremarkable. They managed the royal household, oversaw estates, coordinated logistics, and ensured that the king's daily life functioned smoothly. In theory, they were caretakers. In reality, they became the nerve center of the realm. While kings embodied authority, mayors exercised it. And in a world growing more complex by the generation, exercise mattered more than essence. At first, this arrangement was not perceived as a threat. The Merovingian model of kingship depended on delegation. Others acted so the king would not have to. The mayor's power was derived, not independent. Everything he did was done in the king's name. The sacred bloodline remained untouched, uncontested. But something subtle began to shift. As territories expanded, wars multiplied, and alliances grew more fragile, the people who solved problems gained influence. Military leaders, administrators, and especially mayors became indispensable. They negotiated with nobles, raised armies, distributed land, and maintained order. Over time, they built relationships the kings never needed to form. They accumulated loyalty that was personal rather than symbolic. And loyalty, once redirected, rarely returns. The Merovingian kings did not resist this shift because resistance would have contradicted their role. To rule actively would have meant stepping down from their sacred distance and entering the realm of ordinary power. That was not their function. Their authority lay in not acting. And so they watched as action accumulated elsewhere. This is how power often changes hands, not through rebellion, but through routine. By the 7th century, the mayor of the palace was no longer a household official. He was the effective ruler of the Frankish realms. He commanded armies. He distributed offices. He controlled resources. The king still reigned, but governance had moved on without him. The court revolved around the mayor, not the monarch. And still, the king remained necessary. This dependency frustrated the new power brokers. As long as the Merovingian king lived and remained symbolically intact, all authority flowed through him, even if indirectly. The mayors could not fully legitimize themselves without reference to the sacred bloodline they served. They ruled, but they did not reign. This created an unbearable tension. The Merovingians were becoming obstacles, not because they interfered, but because they reminded everyone that power once came from somewhere else. Their presence exposed the borrowed nature of the mayor's authority, and borrowed power is always insecure. So the strategy changed. Instead of challenging the kings directly, the mayors began to redefine what kingship meant. They emphasized efficiency over sanctity, action over presence. Slowly, the cultural expectation of what a ruler should be shifted. Kings who did not lead armies or issue decrees were portrayed as inadequate. The Merovingians were not attacked. They were reinterpreted. Language did the work again. Chroniclers aligned with the new order began to describe the mayors as protectors of the realm, while the kings became passive dependents. Over time, this framing hardened into judgment. The kings were no longer sacred guardians. They were burdens. Their distance from governance was no longer restraint. It was negligence. And yet, even in this narrative, the mayors did not dare remove them outright. Why? Because deep within Frankish society, the old belief still lingered. Without the Merovingian bloodline, the kingdom lacked legitimacy. The land itself might rebel. Fortune might turn. Disaster might follow. The mayors may have governed, but they feared the consequences of severing the sacred line too abruptly. So they waited. They allowed generations of Merovingian kings to live and die quietly, increasingly powerless, increasingly invisible. Each reign became shorter, less documented, less significant. Memory itself was being thinned. By the time the final transition came, few remembered what the kings had once represented. This was not incompetence. It was preparation. The rise of the mayors of the palace reveals a critical truth about the Merovingian fall. It was not a coup. It was a substitution. One form of authority replaced another without open conflict, by changing the rules of legitimacy rather than breaking them. The mayors learned how to govern without needing sacred blood. They learned how to justify power through success, stability, and eventually religious endorsement. Once those alternative sources of legitimacy were secured, the Merovingians became dispensable. But even then, the final step was taken with extraordinary care. When Merovingian kings were removed, they were not publicly disgraced. They were not executed. They were tonsured, confined, silenced. Their bodies were spared. Their blood was preserved. Only their visibility was destroyed. This choice speaks volumes. The rise of the mayors was not merely political. It was psychological and theological. They understood that destroying a sacred symbol outright could provoke resistance, superstition, or backlash. But rendering it irrelevant, quietly, gradually, that was safer. And so the Merovingian kings became shadows in their own courts. The mayor of the palace, once a servant, became the true ruler of the realm. His authority was practical, enforceable, and increasingly accepted. By the time the Carolingians emerged from this office, the transformation was already complete. The king had been replaced in function long before he was replaced in name. What remains unsettling is how little resistance this transition seems to have met. This silence suggests not apathy, but exhaustion. A population slowly trained to see sacred kingship as obsolete, even embarrassing. A memory dulled until reverence felt archaic. By the time the sacred line was finally sidelined completely, it no longer felt like sacrilege. And yet, the care with which this was done betrays a deeper fear. The mayors ruled because they could, but they rose because the old kings allowed it. The Merovingians were not overpowered, they were outgrown. Their world had changed. Their role had become incompatible with a new vision of order. Still, something about their removal felt unfinished. The sacred blood remained. The myths persisted. The silence lingered. The mayors of the palace had mastered governance. But they had not erased what came before. They had only covered it. And buried foundations, no matter how deeply hidden, continue to shape what is built above them. Long before the Merovingian dynasty officially vanished from power, there were signs that something fundamental had begun to change. Not sudden shocks, not revolts or dramatic betrayals, but subtle disturbances, quiet fractures in the relationship between kingship, memory, and meaning. This was the beginning of Twilight, the moment when a bloodline still existed but was no longer fully seen. The earliest signs were not political. They were symbolic. Merovingian kings continued to be crowned, but their coronations grew quieter. Fewer rituals were recorded. The language surrounding them softened, then thinned. Where earlier texts spoke of sacred lineage and divine favor, later ones spoke merely of succession. The vocabulary of sanctity was slowly replaced by the vocabulary of administration. This shift was not accidental. Language reflects belief, and belief was changing. The kings were still there, but something about how they were perceived had shifted. They were no longer the center of gravity. They were becoming peripheral, present, yet increasingly irrelevant to the daily functioning of the realm. This change did not occur overnight. It unfolded across generations, which made it difficult to notice while it was happening. Each king seemed only slightly less significant than the last. Each reign left a slightly smaller imprint on memory. By the time anyone realized what was happening, the process was already complete. Twilight does not announce itself. It arrives gradually, almost politely. One of the clearest signs was the growing ambiguity around Merovingian authority. Legal documents continued to bear the king's name, but real decisions were made elsewhere. Victories were credited to generals and administrators rather than monarchs. Failures, however, were quietly attributed to the kings. This imbalance shaped perception. Over time, people learned to associate success with those who acted and stagnation with those who symbolized. Another sign was the emergence of doubt. Where earlier generations accepted sacred kingship as a given, later writers began to question it. Not openly. Open doubt would have been dangerous, but indirectly, through tone and emphasis. Stories of Merovingian miracles faded. Their connection to divine favor became vague. The old myths were not refuted. They were ignored. And ignored myths are easier to forget than challenged ones. Yet even as belief weakened, anxiety grew. There are moments in history when power shifts faster than culture can adapt. During these moments, societies become uneasy. They sense that something important is being lost, even if they cannot articulate what it is. In the Merovingian case, this unease appears in scattered sources, monastic writings that speak of disorder, moral decay, and divine withdrawal. These texts rarely mention the kings directly, but the implication is there. Something sacred has slipped out of alignment. The Twilight was not just political. It was spiritual. The old understanding of kingship had tied the health of the land to the body of the king. As Merovingian authority waned, misfortune was interpreted as a sign of cosmic imbalance. Famines, plagues, and defeats were seen not merely as accidents, but as symptoms. Something was wrong at the center. Instead of restoring the sacred role of the king, however, the response was to redefine the center itself. The church increasingly positioned itself as the guarantor of order, morality, and divine favor. Where kings had once embodied sacred continuity, priests and bishops now claimed that role. This shift further marginalized the Merovingians without ever naming them as the problem. They were becoming ghosts in a system that no longer required them. The Twilight also revealed itself through disappearance. Entire Merovingian reigns pass almost unnoticed in the historical record. Some kings are little more than names, their lives summarized in a sentence, their deaths barely acknowledged. This is not how societies treat their rulers, even weak ones. This is how they treat figures they no longer know how to place. When a culture does not know how to integrate a symbol, it erases it quietly. Another sign was the changing treatment of royal blood itself. Marriages into the Merovingian line became less politically significant. Noble families still traced descent, but they did so cautiously, often privately. What had once been a source of pride became something to be managed. The sacred blood was still potent, but increasingly inconvenient. And yet, there are moments when the old fear resurfaces. In times of crisis, the Merovingian kings were still invoked, if only implicitly. Their presence still mattered enough to be controlled. They were kept alive, protected, and carefully isolated. This paradox, irrelevance paired with caution, defines Twilight, a thing believed to be powerless, yet still feared. The signs also appear in how resistance vanished. One would expect that the gradual sidelining of sacred dynasty would provoke rebellion, outrage, or at least recorded dissent. Instead, we find very little. This silence is not evidence of consent. It is evidence of confusion. People sensed that something was ending, but they could not name it. The transition was framed not as loss, but as progress. Twilight is most effective when it is mistaken for evolution. Monastic chroniclers played a crucial role in this process. As the primary record keepers of the era, they shaped memory through selection. What they chose to record became history. What they omitted faded into myth or oblivion. Over time, Merovingian kings simply stopped being interesting to write about. Not because they lacked significance, but because significance itself had been redefined. By the time later historians looked back, the damage was done. The record was thin, fragmented, and dismissive. The Twilight had succeeded. Yet even in this dimming, traces remain. Symbols recur. The long hair, the careful avoidance of royal bloodshed, the persistent fear of severing the line completely. These are remnants of an older worldview that refused to die easily. They suggest that beneath the surface of indifference, something unresolved remained. Twilight, in this sense, is not an ending. It is a suspension. The Merovingians were not removed in a moment of crisis. They were set aside in a moment of redefinition. The world around them changed its understanding of power, and they no longer fit within it. Their sacred role became a relic of an earlier age, respected enough to be preserved, but too dangerous to be revived. As this twilight deepened, it paved the way for what would come next. A return, not of the dynasty itself, but of its memory, sharpened by loss, mythologized by absence, and transformed into something far more unsettling than a line of forgotten kings. Because what fades quietly is rarely gone. It waits. And in the growing darkness of Merovingian twilight, the first outlines of something else begin to appear, something that will challenge the finality of their fall and force later generations to ask whether disappearance was the end or the beginning of a longer design. Among all the Merovingian kings lost to silence, one name continues to disturb the stillness: Dagobert II. His life reads less like a royal biography and more like a warning, an interruption in a process that was meant to unfold quietly. Where other kings faded into obscurity, Dagobert returned, and in doing so, he forced the twilight into the open. Dagobert II was not meant to rule. That is the unspoken premise beneath every account of his life. Born into a dynasty already sliding toward irrelevance, he represented something dangerous: continuity. At a time when the Merovingian bloodline was being gently neutralized, Dagobert embodied its persistence. He was young, legitimate, and, most troubling of all, capable of restoring what had been deliberately hollowed out. His exile came early and swiftly. Still a child, Dagobert was removed from the Frankish court and sent across the sea to Ireland. Officially, this was framed as protection. In reality, it was isolation. Ireland lay beyond the immediate reach of Frankish politics, a place both remote and symbolically significant. It was a land known for monastic scholarship, ancient traditions, and independence from continental power structures. Exile, in this case, was not punishment. It was containment. Dagobert's removal followed the assassination of his father, King Sigebert III, an event that itself bears the marks of calculated erasure. With Sigebert gone, the line should have ended quietly. A child king raised far from the realm posed no immediate threat. Time would do the rest. But time did not cooperate. In Ireland, Dagobert received an education unlike that of most continental rulers. He was immersed in monastic learning, theology, and older traditions that predated the centralized authority of Rome. The Irish Church retained elements of Christianity that were more mystical, less hierarchical, and more tolerant of ancient symbolism. Dagobert was not merely hidden, he was being shaped. This matters. When he eventually returned to the Frankish realm, he did not return as a passive symbol. He returned as a king with awareness of his lineage, of its significance, and perhaps of what had been taken from it. His reappearance disrupted a carefully managed decline. A living Merovingian king, educated, capable, and legitimate, threatened to undo decades of narrative erosion. The circumstances of his return are murky, and that murkiness is revealing. Dagobert did not reclaim the throne through open rebellion. He was restored quietly, with the apparent consent of those who ruled in the shadows. Why would they allow this? Because legitimacy still mattered. The rulers of the time, particularly powerful mayors and nobles, understood that governance without sacred endorsement was fragile. Dagobert's blood carried weight they could not manufacture. Allowing him to return may have seemed safer than provoking unrest or inviting rumors of illegitimacy. But this decision proved costly. Dagobert did not behave like the kings who preceded him. He did not remain distant. He did not accept ceremonial irrelevance. Sources, though sparse, suggest he attempted to assert real authority. He issued charters. He aligned himself with ecclesiastical figures outside the dominant power structures. He appeared, briefly, to challenge the Twilight itself, and that made him intolerable. His assassination was swift and final. Murdered near Stenui around 679, Dagobert II was eliminated with a precision that stands in stark contrast to the gentle sidelining of other Merovingians. This was not containment. This was termination. The message was clear. Return was not permitted. What makes Dagobert's death especially significant is not just that he was killed, but how history responded. His reign was minimized, his significance diluted, his murder framed as a footnote rather than a rupture. Once again, silence followed violence, not the other way around. Yet something changed. Dagobert II became a focal point for later legends, particularly those tied to sacred bloodlines and Grail traditions. In some narratives, he is portrayed as a martyr. In others, as a guardian of hidden knowledge. His tomb became a site of unusual reverence. Whispers grew around his descendants, real or imagined. Why him? Because Dagobert represents the moment when the Merovingian Twilight almost failed. His life exposes the fragility of the strategy used to erase the dynasty. As long as kings remained passive, the system held. But a single active Merovingian ruler threatened to unravel it. This suggests that the decline of the bloodline was not simply natural or inevitable. It was conditional. Dagobert's exile and murder reveal that someone was paying close attention. There's also something symbolically unsettling about his Irish education. Ireland at the time was seen as a repository of older wisdom, both Christian and pre-Christian. Dagobert's connection to this tradition raises uncomfortable questions. Did he return with ideas that challenged the emerging order? Did he embody a synthesis of sacred kingship and spiritual authority that could not be controlled? We cannot know for certain. The sources are too quiet, too cautious. But silence, once again, speaks. If Dagobert II had been merely another weak Merovingian, his return would not have mattered. He could have been ignored. Instead, he was removed decisively. This suggests that his presence posed a real threat, not militarily, but symbolically and theologically. His death marks a turning point. After Dagobert, the Merovingian line never again produced a king who attempted to rule meaningfully. The remaining kings were children, figureheads, or shadows. The twilight resumed, darker and more controlled than before. The system learned from its mistake, and yet Dagobert could not be erased entirely. His story persisted in the margins of history, in local traditions, in whispered genealogies. He became a symbol of what might have been, a reminder that the Merovingian bloodline had not always accepted its fate quietly. In later centuries, those searching for lost legitimacy, sacred lineage, or hidden continuity would return to Dagobert II. They would see in him a fracture in the narrative, a moment when the past pushed back. And perhaps that is why his story endures. Because Dagobert II was not just an exiled king who returned. He was proof that the twilight was enforced. An enforced twilight implies fear. Fear of what might happen if the bloodline ever stepped fully back into the light. Prophecies rarely survive in clear sentences. They endure in fragments, symbols, and distortions, shaped by those who fear them as much as by those who preserve them. The Merovingian Prophecy of Twilight is no exception. It is not a single document hidden in an archive, nor a verse etched into stone. It is a pattern scattered across centuries, embedded in language that learned to speak indirectly when speaking plainly became dangerous. The idea of twilight appears again and again in traditions associated with the Merovingian line, not as an end but as a state, a suspension between presence and absence, power and invisibility. This is what sets the prophecy apart from conventional apocalyptic visions. It does not foretell destruction. It foretells withdrawal. To ancient minds, twilight was a sacred interval. Dawn and dusk were liminal moments, believed to thin the barrier between worlds. What happens in twilight is not finished. It is transformed. When this symbolism is applied to a bloodline, it suggests not extinction, but concealment, a turning inward, a retreat from the visible world. The prophecy, as it can be reconstructed, speaks of a time when the sacred line would no longer rule openly, not because it failed, but because the world around it would no longer recognize the form of authority it embodied. Kingship based on blood, myth, and divine presence will become incompatible with a new age of institutions, contracts, and clerical control. In this telling, the fall of the Merovingians was anticipated. This alone changes everything. If the twilight was foreseen, then the dynasty's passive decline, its lack of resistance, and its quiet disappearance take on a different meaning. What appears as weakness becomes obedience to destiny. What appears as surrender becomes strategy. Fragments of this idea surface in monastic writings that describe history as cyclical rather than linear. Power rises, fades, and returns in altered form. Certain families, certain lines, are said to withdraw at appointed times, preserving something essential while the world reshapes itself. These texts are careful. They do not name names, but the structure is unmistakable. Other fragments appear in symbolic language tied to kingship and light. The sun sets, but is not destroyed. The crown passes into shadow, but remains intact. The king sleeps rather than dies. These metaphors repeat across regions associated with Merovingian influence, suggesting a shared narrative beneath the surface. Even the way Merovingian kings were removed aligns with this prophetic logic. They were not executed en masse. They were not publicly condemned. They were silenced, secluded, and preserved. The bloodline was allowed to continue biologically, even as it vanished politically. This is not how enemies are treated. It is how dangerous inheritances are contained. The prophecy also seems to imply that Twilight is temporary. This is the most unsettling aspect. If the Merovingian line was meant to withdraw rather than end, then disappearance is not final. It is a waiting period, a time during which memory fades, threats pass, and the world forgets what it once feared. Only then could something return, changed, adapted, or revealed in a new form. This idea terrified later authorities. A prophecy that speaks of return is far more dangerous than one that speaks of doom. Doom can be survived. Return must be prevented. And so the prophecy itself was never allowed to exist openly. It was broken apart, absorbed into allegory, scattered across unrelated texts. No single source could be pointed to and condemned. The knowledge became diffuse, almost folkloric. Enough to persist, not enough to provoke action. This scattering is why modern historians struggle to locate the prophecy. They search for a document, when what remains is a tradition, a way of interpreting events rather than predicting them. The prophecy may have been as simple as a belief held within the Merovingian circle, that their time would end, but their line would not. Such beliefs shape behavior. If a dynasty believes its fall is inevitable but temporary, it will not resist in conventional ways. It will avoid martyrdom. It will preserve blood and memory rather than territory. It will accept exile over execution, obscurity over extinction. This aligns disturbingly well with what actually happened. After Dagobert II, no Merovingian king challenged his fate. The twilight deepened. The kings receded. The prophecy, if it existed, was being fulfilled. The line entered dormancy, not defeat. Yet prophecies are not passive things. They influence how others respond as well. Those who believe the Merovingians carried a destiny beyond their visible reign would have been wary of destroying them outright. Killing a prophesied line can validate the prophecy. Letting it fade avoids confrontation with destiny itself. Twilight, again, is safer than night. This may explain the extraordinary care taken with Merovingian descendants. Why their blood was spared. Why their memory was diluted rather than erased. Why their symbols were mocked rather than burned. Mockery drains reverence. It does not provoke prophecy. In later centuries, echoes of the Twilight prophecy reappear in unexpected places. In Grail legends that speak of a hidden king. In medieval romances that describe rightful rulers living in exile, waiting for the proper time. In esoteric traditions that emphasize lineage preserved in secrecy. These stories may not reference the Merovingians directly, but they carry the same structure: withdrawal, concealment, preservation, return. Whether these echoes are intentional or unconscious hardly matters. They reveal how deeply the idea had embedded itself in European imagination. The prophecy also reframes the role of those who replaced the Merovingians. The Carolingians did not merely seize power. They stepped into a world that the prophecy had already emptied. They ruled in the daylight while something else waited in shadow. Their legitimacy depended on permanence, but permanence is fragile when built on denial. This may be why later European history became so obsessed with bloodlines, rightful kings, and lost legitimacy. The unresolved twilight of the Merovingians left a wound in the narrative of authority, a sense that something had been paused rather than concluded. In the end, the prophecy of Twilight is less about predicting the future than explaining the past. It offers a framework that makes sense of silence, restraint, and survival. It suggests that the Merovingians did not misunderstand their fate. They accepted it. An acceptance, guided by belief, can be more powerful than resistance. As we move forward, this prophetic lens will cast long shadows. It will influence how we interpret the rise of new dynasties, the emergence of secret traditions, and the persistent fascination with a bloodline that, according to official history, should have meant nothing at all. Twilight, after all, is not darkness. It is the promise that light has not gone. It has only learned how to hide. When history describes the end of the Merovingians and the rise of the Carolingians, it often reaches for the language of inevitability. One dynasty declined, another rose. Weakness was replaced by strength, chaos by order. But this framing hides something essential. What occurred was not a coup in the traditional sense. There was no dramatic overthrow, no storming of palaces, no public execution of kings. Instead, there was something far more subtle and far more revealing. The Carolingian takeover was a transformation of legitimacy itself. By the time the Carolingians emerged as rulers, the Merovingians were already shadows. Their authority had been hollowed out over generations. The machinery of governance was firmly in the hands of the mayors of the palace, and the population had been conditioned to accept this arrangement as normal. The kings still existed, but only as symbols whose meaning had been deliberately blurred. This was the environment in which the Carolingians acted. Pepin the Short, the most famous of these mayors, did not seize power through violence. He asked a question, and that question changed everything. He turned to the papacy and asked who should be called king, the one who held power or the one who bore the title. It was a deceptively simple inquiry, but it carried revolutionary implications. For the first time, kingship was being defined not by blood or tradition, but by function and by external approval. The church answered in Pepin's favor. This moment is often treated as a legal technicality, a clever political maneuver. In truth, it marked a complete reorientation of authority. Kingship was no longer inherent. It was conditional. It could be granted, withdrawn, and redefined by an institution that claimed divine mediation. This was not a coup against the Merovingians. It was a coup against their worldview. The Merovingian kings were not overthrown because they failed to rule. They were replaced because their form of legitimacy no longer fit the emerging order. Sacred blood without ecclesiastical endorsement was unacceptable. Passive authority without institutional control was dangerous. By asking the church to legitimize his rule, Pepin was not just seeking approval. He was aligning kingship with a new source of power. The crown would now flow from God through the church to the ruler, not through blood and myth to the people. This arrangement benefited everyone except the Merovingians. The last Merovingian king, Childeric III, was not killed. He was tonsured and sent to a monastery. Once again, blood was spared. The dynasty ended not with a scream, but with a quiet ritual stripping. Hair cut, identity erased, visibility removed. This choice reveals the true nature of the transition. If the Carolingians had believed the Merovingians were truly meaningless, they would not have bothered with such care. They could have ignored them entirely. Instead, they ensured that the sacred markers of Merovingian legitimacy were dismantled publicly and symbolically. The act was not about punishment. It was about closure. And yet, even this closure feels incomplete. The Carolingians worked tirelessly to distance themselves from Merovingian legacy while quietly absorbing its structures. They inherited the territory, the court, the administrative machinery, but not the blood. That distinction mattered. To compensate, they leaned heavily on religious endorsement, ritual coronation, and visible displays of power. What blood once guaranteed, ceremony now had to enforce. This dependency on the church created a new vulnerability. Unlike sacred blood, institutional legitimacy must be constantly renewed. It depends on alliances, obedience, and narrative control. The Carolingians understood this, which is why they invested so heavily in rewriting history. Merovingian kings were portrayed as failures to justify their removal. The past had to be reshaped so the present could stand securely. And so the myth of the do-nothing kings hardened into doctrine. This was not mere propaganda. It was defensive architecture. As long as people believed the Merovingians had deserved to fall, no one would question what had been lost. The transition would feel natural rather than engineered. But engineered it was. The Carolingians did not challenge Merovingian authority directly, because direct challenge would have acknowledged its legitimacy. Instead, they rendered it obsolete by redefining the rules of power. They did not overthrow a dynasty. They replaced a concept. This distinction matters because it explains the lingering unease that followed. Even after the Carolingians were crowned, even after Charlemagne built his empire, something felt unfinished. The new order was powerful, expansive, and visible, but lacked the quiet certainty of sacred blood. It needed constant reinforcement. Laws, councils, rituals, declarations. The old kings had needed none of these. This difference haunted medieval political thought. It resurfaced in debates about rightful kingship, divine right, and legitimacy. It fueled rebellions framed not as revolts, but as restorations. It inspired legends of hidden heirs and sleeping kings. The twilight of the Merovingians cast a shadow the Carolingians could not fully escape. In this light, the so-called Carolingian coup appears less like a triumph and more like a compromise. A necessary adaptation to a changing world, achieved at the cost of something older and less controllable. The Merovingians were not defeated because they were weak. They were sidelined because they were incompatible. And incompatibility, when managed carefully, leaves fewer scars than conquest. The Carolingian era that followed was one of consolidation, expansion, and visible authority. It reshaped Europe. It standardized power. It aligned throne and altar in ways that would define centuries. But beneath its achievements lies an unresolved question. What happens to authority that is not destroyed, but displaced? The Merovingians did not vanish in battle. They vanished in theory. Their blood remained. Their myths lingered. Their prophecy of twilight unfolded exactly as such a prophecy would. Not in spectacle, but in silence. And silence, when it follows something sacred, is rarely empty. Once the Carolingians had secured the throne, a deeper problem remained unresolved. Power had been transferred, but legitimacy still felt fragile. The Merovingian bloodline had not been destroyed, only displaced. And as long as memory lingered, so did comparison. The new order required not just authority, but certainty. To achieve that, history itself had to be disciplined. This is where the church entered fully into the story, not merely as a spiritual institution, but as the architect of a new reality. The alliance between the Carolingian crown and the church was not born from devotion alone. It was a mutual necessity. The Carolingians needed divine endorsement to compensate for what they lacked in sacred blood. The church needed kings who would enforce orthodoxy, suppress rival traditions, and centralize belief under Rome's authority. Together, they could redefine what legitimacy meant. But redefining legitimacy required something else: forgetting. The Merovingians represented a form of authority that the church could not fully explain, control, or replicate. Their sacred kingship predated papal coronations. Their legitimacy flowed from lineage and myth rather than sacrament and doctrine. As long as this memory remained intact, the church's claim to mediate all divine authority was incomplete. So a decision was made, quietly, carefully. The past will be rewritten. This did not happen through a single decree or council. It happened through selection, through emphasis, through omission. Monks copied manuscripts, but they chose which ones. Chroniclers wrote histories, but they framed events according to new assumptions. Over generations, these choices accumulated into something that felt natural, even inevitable. The Merovingians were not erased outright. That would have raised suspicion. Instead, they were diminished. Their sacred qualities were stripped away and replaced with caricature. Their kings were portrayed as weak, lazy, foolish. Their long hair became a symbol of decadence rather than sanctity. Their passivity was rebranded as failure. This was the necessary lie. Not a lie of invention, but a lie of interpretation. By redefining the Merovingians as unworthy rulers, the church justified their removal without confronting the deeper question of why they had once been revered. The past became a moral lesson rather than a mystery, and moral lessons discourage curiosity. At the same time, the church elevated its own rituals as the sole channel of divine authority. Anointing replaced inheritance. Coronation replaced lineage. Blessing replaced blood. Kingship was no longer something one was born into, it was something one received. This shift was revolutionary. For the first time in Western Europe, sacred authority was fully institutionalized. No family, no bloodline, no myth could claim divine right without ecclesiastical approval. This centralized power in unprecedented ways. It also made the church indispensable. But such a system is inherently anxious. Institutions require maintenance. They depend on obedience, coherence, and narrative stability. Anything that suggests alternative sources of authority, even ancient ones, must be neutralized. The Merovingian memory, with its sacred blood and pre-Christian echoes, was precisely such a threat. So the church did what institutions do best. It standardized truth. Texts that aligned with the new theology were copied and preserved. Those that did not were allowed to fade. Oral traditions were discouraged. Local cults were absorbed or suppressed. Sacred landscapes were reinterpreted through Christian symbolism. Over time, the Merovingian worldview became unintelligible to those who inherited the rewritten past. And yet, something resisted. Despite centuries of narrative control, Merovingian echoes refused to disappear entirely. Their bloodline continued to surface in genealogies. Their symbols reappeared in art and legend. Their association with sacred guardianship survived in Grail mythology and esoteric traditions. These remnants were inconvenient, but they were too diffused to confront directly, so they were dismissed as nonsense. The church labeled them superstition, heresy, or fantasy. Scholars were encouraged to treat them as curiosities rather than clues. The necessary lie held, not because everyone believed it, but because no alternative was allowed to cohere. This strategy worked remarkably well. By the High Middle Ages, the Merovingians had become a footnote, a primitive dynasty replaced by a superior one. The church stood at the center of spiritual life, unchallenged by rival claims of sacred blood. Kings ruled by divine right, but only as defined by Rome. And yet, the very need for such control reveals insecurity. If the Merovingian legacy truly posed no threat, it would not have required such careful suppression. If sacred blood were merely a myth, it could have been debated openly. Instead, it was smothered beneath ridicule and silence. That choice suggests fear, not of the past as it was, but of what it might still represent. Because blood does not obey institutions. Unlike titles or offices, lineage cannot be revoked. It persists quietly, passing from generation to generation regardless of who holds power. This made the Merovingians uniquely dangerous. Even stripped of thrones and symbols, their blood remained intact. The church understood this. That is why Merovingian descendants were never publicly hunted or exterminated. That would have drawn attention. Instead, they were absorbed, intermarried, obscured. Their identity diluted, their significance blurred. This was containment, not conquest, and it required the necessary lie to endure. The lie said that nothing had been lost, that history had improved, that sacred kingship had evolved into something better, that the old myths were childish and irrelevant. The lie reassured people that order was permanent and divinely sanctioned. But lies maintained over centuries leave cracks. In moments of crisis, plague, war, schism, people return to older questions. Who truly has the right to rule? Where does authority really come from? Why do institutions fail so often? In these moments, suppressed memories resurface, and the Merovingians, strangely, reappear. They emerge not as historical figures, but as symbols of an alternative. A time when authority was embodied rather than imposed, when kingship was inherited rather than granted, when the sacred was not mediated but lived. This is why later secret traditions became obsessed with Merovingian bloodlines. It is why genealogical myths flourished. It is why the idea of a hidden or sleeping king persisted long after the dynasty's fall. These were not fantasies of power. They were expressions of doubt. Doubt in a necessary lie. The church and the crown built a world that required constant affirmation. Councils, decrees, rituals, dogma. The Merovingian world had required none of these. Its authority had been assumed, not enforced. That difference haunted the medieval imagination. And so, the necessary lie remained necessary. It had to be taught, repeated, and defended. The Merovingians had to remain weak, foolish, and obsolete in the story that Europe told itself. But stories are fragile things. They depend on silence to survive. And silence, as this history has shown again and again, is never as empty as it appears. When a dynasty disappears from thrones and chronicles, history assumes it has ended. But blood does not follow the rules of history. It does not vanish when crowns are removed or names are struck from records. It moves quietly, invisibly, through marriages, migrations, and forgotten branches. And this is where the Merovingian story becomes most unsettling, because despite every effort to neutralize it, the bloodline did not end. It adapted. After the final Merovingian kings were removed from power, no purge followed. No systematic elimination. No public reckoning. Instead, the descendants of the once sacred line were absorbed into the fabric of Europe. They married into noble families. They faded into regional aristocracy. Their identity dissolved slowly, not through violence, but through dilution. This was not an accident. Those who had orchestrated the dynasty's disappearance understood a crucial truth. Destroying a sacred bloodline can preserve its power and memory. Allowing it to live quietly and anonymously drains its potency over time. Obscurity is safer than martyrdom. Survival without recognition is the most effective form of erasure. And yet, even obscured blood remembers itself. Throughout medieval Europe, noble families quietly trace their lineage back to Merovingian ancestors. These genealogies were not always publicized. Often they appear in private records, marginal notes, or local traditions rather than official histories. To modern scholars, many of these claims seem exaggerated or fabricated, but their persistence across regions and centuries suggests something deeper than coincidence. Why would families cling to a lineage officially deemed irrelevant? Because lineage is not only about power. It is about legitimacy, identity, and memory. In a world where authority had become institutionalized, bloodlines offered an alternative sense of continuity. Even stripped of political meaning, Merovingian descent carried symbolic weight. It connected families to an older order, one that predated papal coronations and centralized rule. This connection was both valuable and dangerous. Publicly claiming Merovingian descent could invite suspicion or ridicule. Privately preserving it offered quiet prestige and a sense of belonging to something hidden but enduring. Over time, this created a strange duality. The bloodline survived not as a banner, but as a whisper. There are regions where this whisper grew louder. In parts of southern France, particularly areas later associated with Grail legends and esoteric traditions, Merovingian ancestry was treated with unusual reverence. Local nobility claimed descent through obscure lines. Churches displayed symbols that hinted at older meanings beneath Christian iconography. Landscapes themselves were read as maps of hidden continuity. To outsiders, these were eccentricities. To insiders, they were acknowledgments. The idea that the Merovingian bloodline survived also explains the extraordinary fascination later secret societies showed toward genealogy. Groups like the supposed Priory of Chaon, whatever their true origins, fixated obsessively on bloodlines, descent, and hidden heirs. Even when their claims were exaggerated or fabricated, the obsession itself reveals a cultural anxiety, the fear that legitimacy might still reside where institutions had buried it. The Merovingians became the archetype of this fear. They were the royal line that did not die, only withdrew. The kings who vanished without closure. The blood that continued to flow without permission. In a Europe increasingly defined by laws, borders, and bureaucracies, this kind of continuity was unsettling. And so, the bloodline was allowed to exist, but only as long as it remained invisible. There is a pattern worth noting. Whenever a figure emerged who could plausibly claim Merovingian descent and public authority, resistance followed swiftly. Claims were discredited. Lineages were questioned. attention was diverted. The idea of a living Merovingian legacy was tolerated only in abstract, never in embodied form. This suggests that the bloodline was not feared as history, but as possibility. The survival of Merovingian blood also reframes earlier decisions. The careful avoidance of royal bloodshed, the choice of monastic confinement over execution, the willingness to let descendants live. All of these point to an unspoken recognition that blood cannot be undone. It can only be managed. In this sense, the Merovingian Twilight succeeded. The bloodline survived biologically, but not symbolically. It lived on without a crown, without a name that carried weight, without a role that threatened the established order. And yet, something persisted. Legends of hidden kings, rightful heirs, and sleeping bloodlines did not emerge from nowhere. They are cultural expressions of unresolved history. The Merovingians, more than any other dynasty, fit the pattern these legends describe. Their end lacked finality. Their disappearance lacked drama. Their blood lacked closure. This absence became fertile ground for myth. In medieval romances, the rightful king is often in exile, unaware of his identity, waiting for the proper moment. In Grail stories, guardianship is passed through lineage, not office. In esoteric Christianity, blood carries spiritual meaning beyond doctrine. These themes echo Merovingian history with unsettling precision. Whether these stories preserve literal truth or symbolic memory is less important than the fact that they exist at all. They reveal a collective intuition that something was left unfinished. The Merovingian bloodline refused to die because it did not need to survive visibly. Its power, whatever it once was, adapted to a world that no longer had space for sacred kingship. It became latent, dormant, waiting. This waiting is the most disturbing aspect of the story. A dead dynasty poses no threat. A forgotten one poses little more. But a bloodline that survives quietly, stripped of power but not of identity, exists outside the control of institutions. It cannot be crowned or condemned. It simply is. And that is why the Merovingians continue to haunt European history. Not as rulers, but as a question. What happens to authority that is not destroyed, only hidden? What becomes of sacred legitimacy when the world refuses to recognize it? And how many other bloodlines, traditions, or truths have been pushed into twilight rather than confronted directly? The Merovingians were not the last to experience this fate, but they may have been the first. Their bloodline flows onward, indistinguishable from others, yet never entirely gone. It survives not in thrones or titles, but in the uneasy fascination it still provokes. In the way scholars argue over its significance. In the way myths refuse to let it rest. Because blood that has once been sacred is never fully ordinary again. It may lose its crown. It may lose its name, but it does not forget what it once carried. And history, no matter how carefully edited, never quite succeeds in forgetting it either. Long after the Merovingian kings vanished from thrones and chronicles, their presence resurfaced in an unexpected place, not in political history, but in myth. Specifically, in the strange, layered, and deeply symbolic traditions surrounding the Holy Grail. To modern eyes, Grail stories appear as medieval fantasies, knights, quests, miracles. But beneath the romance lies a structure that feels uncomfortably familiar. A hidden lineage, a sacred trust passed through blood. Guardians who protect something too powerful to be displayed openly. This is where the Merovingian shadow grows long. The earliest Grail narratives do not describe a chalice alone. They describe a mystery. Something carried, protected, concealed. Something tied not to conquest, but to worthiness and lineage. In many versions, the Grail is never truly possessed, it is guarded. And the guardians are rarely kings in the conventional sense. They are wounded kings, sleeping kings, hidden kings. Kings whose authority is real but suspended. The parallels to the Merovingian Twilight are difficult to ignore. In Grail lore, the rightful king is often removed from active rule due to a wound, physical or spiritual, that renders him incapable of governing openly. The land suffers in his absence, becoming barren or disordered. Only when the right conditions are met can healing occur. Until then, the king waits, alive but unseen. This is not the story of a fallen dynasty. It is the story of a dynasty in suspension. Medieval audiences did not invent these themes in isolation. They drew upon collective memory, reshaping history into symbol when direct expression was no longer possible. As sacred kingship was erased from political life, it re-emerged in narrative form. The Grail became a vessel for ideas that could no longer be discussed openly. Bloodline legitimacy, divine inheritance, and authority independent of institutions. In several traditions, the Grail is explicitly linked to lineage rather than object. It is not something anyone can find. It belongs to a family. It is passed down, guarded, protected from misuse. This reframing is crucial. It shifts the Grail from artifact to inheritance. An inheritance is the language of blood. Some Grail legends go further, suggesting that the Grail is not a cup at all, but a symbol of sacred descent, the bloodline of Christ himself. Whether literal or metaphorical, this idea directly challenges institutional Christianity. It places sanctity in blood rather than church mediation. And once again, we encounter a structure disturbingly similar to Merovingian belief. Sacred blood, hidden guardianship, withdrawal rather than destruction. The Merovingians fit seamlessly into this mythic architecture. They were a royal line associated with sacred origin myths, passive kingship, and careful preservation rather than domination. They vanished without annihilation. Their bloodline survived quietly. Their memory resurfaced in stories about hidden kings and sacred inheritance. If one were searching for a historical template upon which Grail mythology could crystallize, it would be difficult to find a better candidate. This does not mean Grail legends are literal histories of the Merovingians. It means they preserved the shape of a memory that history itself could no longer hold. Later esoteric traditions made this connection explicit. Medieval secret societies, mystical orders, and speculative genealogists increasingly linked Merovingian blood to Grail guardianship. They suggested that the dynasty's true role had never been governance, but protection of sacred knowledge, sacred blood, or sacred continuity. From this perspective, the Merovingian fall looks less like failure and more like transition. Guardians do not rule openly. They withdraw when exposure becomes dangerous. They preserve rather than conquer. And when the world changes, they adapt by becoming invisible. This logic explains why Grail guardians are often portrayed as isolated, wounded, or hidden. Visibility invites corruption. Power attracts violence. To protect what is sacred, one must step away from the center of attention. The Church, of course, could not tolerate this idea. A sacred lineage that bypassed ecclesiastical authority undermined the Church's claim to exclusive mediation between God and humanity. Grail stories that hinted at such lineage were therefore treated cautiously. Some were embraced in sanitized form. Others were condemned or ignored. Over time, the Grail became a theological curiosity rather than a political threat. But the underlying anxiety remained. Why else would the Church tolerate stories that subtly suggested authority could exist outside its control? Why allow legends of hidden kings and sacred blood to circulate at all? The answer may be simple. Suppression was no longer effective. The ideas had already migrated into myth, where they were harder to confront directly. Myth is resilient. It allows dangerous ideas to survive in altered form. A lineage too threatening to acknowledge historically can live on symbolically. A prophecy too destabilizing to teach can be disguised as romance. The Grail legends performed this function brilliantly. And at the center of this symbolic world stands the Merovingian shadow, never named outright, but always implied. This shadow also explains why later centuries became obsessed with uncovering lost bloodlines and hidden guardians. From Renaissance mystics to modern conspiracy theorists, the same questions resurface. Who guards the sacred? Where did the rightful line go? What was lost when certain kings disappeared? These questions are not new. They echo the unresolved twilight of the Merovingians. The Grail, in this sense, is not an object waiting to be found. It is a memory waiting to be understood. A memory of authority that did not need permission. Of sanctity that flowed through lineage rather than institution. Of power that chose invisibility over compromise. Whether the Merovingians were literal Grail guardians is ultimately less important than the role they came to symbolize. They became the archetype of the hidden line, the royal family that stepped out of history rather than submit to redefinition. And archetypes are powerful. They shape how societies understand loss, legitimacy, and hope. They resurface whenever people feel that authority has become hollow or corrupt. They offer the comforting, unsettling idea that somewhere, something pure has been preserved. The Merovingian shadow lingers precisely because it occupies this space between history and myth. Too real to dismiss, too obscure to confirm, perfectly positioned to haunt the imagination. As long as people believe that truth can be hidden rather than destroyed, the Grail legend will endure. And as long as it endures, the Merovingians will never fully disappear from the story. They will remain what they have always been in the centuries since their fall. Not rulers of land, but guardians of a question the world has never quite answered. There are places where history feels louder than it should, where landscapes seem to carry memories that refuse to stay buried. Rennes-le-Château is one such place. On the surface, it is an unremarkable village in southern France. Isolated, windswept, and easily overlooked. And yet, over the last 2 centuries, it has become a focal point for whispers about hidden bloodlines, secret knowledge, and suppressed histories. Its pull is not accidental. It sits at the intersection of silence and memory. To understand why Rennes-le-Château matters, one must first understand geography as more than terrain. In medieval Europe, landscapes were symbolic. Hills, rivers, crossroads, and churches were not merely functional. They were chosen, layered, and encoded with meaning. Sacred lines were drawn across the land long before modern maps, connecting sites of power, burial, and ritual. These invisible networks carried memory in ways that texts often could not. Rennes-le-Château lies at the heart of such a network. The region surrounding it is saturated with Merovingian traces. Ancient churches built on older foundations. Unusual iconography that deviates subtly from Orthodox Christian symbolism. Burial sites attributed, sometimes controversially, to Merovingian royalty. None of these elements alone prove anything. Together, they form a pattern that is difficult to ignore. Patterns are dangerous. They invite questions that official narratives prefer to leave unanswered. Why would a supposedly irrelevant dynasty leave such a dense imprint on a region centuries after its fall? Why do legends of hidden treasure, sacred blood, and secret guardianship converge here rather than elsewhere? The answer may lie not in what Rennes-le-Château reveals, but in what it conceals. In the late 19th century, the village became infamous due to the actions of a parish priest, Berenger Saunière. His sudden wealth, inexplicable renovations, and cryptic behavior sparked endless speculation. Some claimed he had discovered hidden documents. Others believed he uncovered treasure. Still others suggested he stumbled upon genealogical secrets too dangerous to reveal. Regardless of the truth, the myth took hold. And myths do not attach themselves randomly. They gravitate toward places already resonant with unresolved history. Rennes-le-Château did not become mysterious because of Saunière. Saunière became mysterious because of Rennes-le-Château. The legends surrounding the village frequently return to one theme: hidden lineage. Not gold, not artifacts, but blood. The idea that something or someone was being protected by geography itself. That the land was chosen not for its wealth, but for its obscurity. This aligns perfectly with the logic of Merovingian Twilight. If a bloodline wished to survive unnoticed, it would retreat to places beyond political centers. It would settle in regions difficult to control, rich in local tradition, resistant to centralized authority. Southern France, with its history of religious independence, heterodox movements, and cultural persistence, fits this profile precisely. The Church knew this region well and feared it. The Cathars, centuries later, would challenge ecclesiastical authority here, only to be brutally suppressed. Before them, older traditions lingered, quietly incompatible with Rome's vision of orthodoxy. The land itself seemed to resist full assimilation. This resistance makes it an ideal refuge for memories that could not survive elsewhere. Rennes-le-Château sits atop layers of such resistance. Maps of the region reveal alignments that some researchers believe connect churches, hilltops, and ancient sites in deliberate patterns. These alignments are often dismissed as coincidence, but coincidence becomes harder to accept when patterns repeat across cultures and centuries. Sacred geography is one of humanity's oldest methods of preservation. When texts are destroyed, land remains. The Merovingians, with their emphasis on blood and continuity rather than institution, would have understood this instinctively. If their legacy were to survive, it would need anchors that could not be easily erased, places rather than proclamations, stones rather than scrolls. This may explain why certain regions appear again and again in Merovingian-related lore, why burial sites are rumored but never confirmed, why churches are rebuilt on older foundations rather than abandoned, why silence itself becomes part of the architecture. Silence is protective. Rennes-le-Château does not proclaim its secrets. It hints at them, symbols carved into stone, phrases that feel out of place, imagery that unsettles without explaining why. These are not proofs. They are invitations to look deeper and warnings not to expect clarity. The geography of silence extends beyond a single village. It is a network of places that collectively hold what history could not openly carry. Each site alone appears insignificant. Together, they suggest intentional concealment rather than accidental survival. This network challenges the assumption that history moves only through documents and decrees. It suggests that memory can be spatial, that lineage can be preserved through place, that truth can be hidden in plain sight, protected by ambiguity. Modern fascination with Rennes-le-Château often misses this point. Treasure hunters search for gold. Conspiracy theorists hunt for documents. But the most valuable thing this geography protects is continuity, the unbroken thread of something that chose to step away from visibility. The Merovingian bloodline, if it survived in any meaningful sense, would not announce itself. It would leave traces rather than declarations. It would embed itself in land and tradition, not in crowns or titles. This is why Rennes-le-Château refuses to yield answers. It was never meant to. Its role is not revelation, but preservation. Not proof, but persistence. It stands as a reminder that some histories survive precisely because they are never fully told. The Church understood this danger, which is why regions like this were monitored, reshaped, and symbolically reclaimed. Churches were rededicated. Meanings were overwritten. Yet overwriting is not erasure. Old symbols bleed through new ones. Old alignments survive beneath new structures, and those who know how to look notice. Rennes-le-Château endures not because it holds a single secret, but because it represents a method, a way of carrying forbidden memory through time without confrontation. A geography designed not to reveal, but to endure. In this sense, the village is not an anomaly. It is a model of how the Merovingian legacy may have survived, not through power, not through proclamation, but through quiet placement in the folds of landscape, where history rarely looks and authority rarely reaches. As the Merovingian twilight deepened, geography became its archive. Stone replaced parchment. Silence replaced speech. The land itself became the guardian. And guardianship, as Grail legends remind us, is not about showing what is protected. It is about ensuring that what is protected is never truly lost. Centuries after the Merovingians slipped into twilight, long after their names have been reduced to footnotes and caricatures, something unexpected happened. They returned, not as kings, not as rulers, but as an obsession. In the modern era, when Europe believed itself rational, enlightened, and free from medieval superstition, the Merovingians began to surface again in whispers, theories, and revivals that felt strangely out of place. This was not a resurrection of power. It was a resurrection of meaning. The modern resurrection myth did not emerge from royal courts or churches. It emerged from scholars, antiquarians, mystics, and eventually from popular culture. It began quietly, with questions that history had never fully answered. Why had the Merovingians been dismissed so thoroughly? Why did their fall feel unresolved? Why did their story, unlike so many others, refuse to feel complete? These questions found fertile ground in the 19th century, an age obsessed with origins. As nationalism spread across Europe, nations searched for ancient roots to justify modern identities. Bloodlines, founding myths, and lost dynasties became sources of fascination rather than embarrassment. In this climate, the Merovingians reappeared, not as failures but as enigmas. Genealogists began to re-examine noble lineages. Symbols once dismissed as decorative were reinterpreted as codes. Old manuscripts were reread with new suspicion. The Merovingians, once treated as primitive relics, were suddenly framed as holders of something lost, a legitimacy that modern states could not quite replicate. This reframing was subtle but powerful. Instead of asking how the Merovingians fell, people began asking what had replaced them, and whether that replacement was truly superior. The old narrative of progress began to crack. Institutions that had promised stability delivered wars, revolutions, and fragmentation. In times of disillusionment, suppressed histories often resurface. The Merovingians became a mirror. They represented an alternative vision of authority, one based on lineage, myth, and continuity rather than bureaucracy and ideology. This did not mean people wanted them back as rulers. It meant people wanted to understand what had been lost when sacred kingship disappeared. This longing gave rise to resurrection myths. Some were academic, cautious, grounded in documents and archaeology. Others were speculative, symbolic, or deliberately provocative. Together, they formed a cultural undercurrent that suggested the Merovingians had not simply ended. They had been interrupted. One of the most influential expressions of this idea came through claims of hidden bloodlines. The notion that Merovingian descendants still lived, unrecognized but intact, captured the imagination. It transformed genealogy into mystery. Lineage became destiny again, not politically, but symbolically. These claims were rarely provable. Often they were exaggerated or fabricated. But their popularity reveals something important. People were less interested in factual confirmation than in narrative coherence. The Merovingian story felt unfinished, and modern myths attempted to finish it. Secret societies played a role in this process, whether real or imagined. Groups like the supposed Priory of Shaun, despite later exposure as largely fictitious, demonstrated how eager people were to believe in hidden guardianship. The idea that someone, somewhere, had preserved a forbidden lineage was comforting. It suggested continuity in a world that felt increasingly fractured. Even when such groups were exposed as hoaxes, the fascination did not disappear. That is because the resurrection myth was never really about the Merovingians themselves. It was about distrust. Distrust in official history. Distrust in institutional authority. Distrust in narratives that claimed finality where none was felt. Popular culture amplified this dramatically. Novels, films, and documentaries reintroduced the Merovingians to mass audiences, often blending history with speculation. They were portrayed as keepers of sacred blood, linked to Grail lore, ancient secrets, and suppressed truths. Critics dismissed these portrayals as sensationalist, yet their impact was undeniable. Millions encountered the Merovingians not as failed kings, but as custodians of mystery. This shift matters. Once a dynasty becomes mythic again, it escapes the control of historians. It enters the realm of archetype. And archetypes do not require proof to function. They speak to intuition, not evidence. The modern resurrection myth recasts the Merovingians as symbols of something humanity suspects it has lost: authentic legitimacy. A sense of authority that feels rooted rather than imposed. A connection to the past that is not mediated by institutions. In this narrative, the Merovingians are not coming back to rule. They are coming back to remind. They remind us that history is written by those who win, but memory belongs to those who doubt. They remind us that disappearance does not equal irrelevance. And they remind us that silence can be more powerful than proclamation. Critically, the modern resurrection myth also reframes the prophecy of Twilight. Twilight is no longer medieval fate. It becomes metaphor. The Merovingians entered Twilight because the world was not ready to integrate what they represented. Modernity, with all its disillusionment, begins to feel like the other side of that threshold. This does not mean the prophecy is literal. It means the idea resonates. The resurgence of Merovingian fascination coincides with moments of crisis. The aftermath of revolutions, the collapse of empires, the erosion of trust in institutions. Each time authority feels hollow, people search for alternatives, often in the past. The Merovingians provide a ready-made symbol of a different path history might have taken. And symbols, once revived, do not return quietly. The resurrection myth also carries danger. It invites manipulation. Claims of hidden bloodlines can be used to legitimize power, foster elitism, or fuel conspiracy thinking. This is why institutions react defensively to such narratives, dismissing them outright rather than engaging thoughtfully. But dismissal does not erase desire. As long as people feel that official history withholds something, resurrection myths will thrive. The Merovingians will continue to be reimagined, not because evidence demands it, but because imagination needs them. They occupy a unique space in the modern mind, not fully historical, not fully mythical, suspended like Twilight itself. And that suspension is the key. The Merovingians survived into modern consciousness precisely because their ending lacked resolution. They were not destroyed, judged, or conclusively explained. They were neutralized, hidden, and forgotten too deliberately. Modern myths sense this imbalance and attempt to correct it, not with facts, but with meaning. In doing so, they reveal something profound about how societies relate to the past. History is not just a record of events. It is a negotiation between what happened and what we can live with. When that negotiation feels dishonest, forgotten stories return. The Merovingians have returned many times already, in legend, in theory, in fiction, in obsession. They may never return as rulers, but they do not need to. Their resurrection is complete the moment people begin to ask the question that history tried so hard to silence. What if the bloodline did not fail? What if it stepped aside, and we are only now beginning to feel the cost of that absence? That question alone ensures that the Merovingian Twilight is not over. It has simply entered a new phase, one where memory, not power, carries the crown.